Hello and welcome to the Design podcast from the Methodist Church, conversations on living life to the full. Today I'm very pleased to be sitting here with the Reverend Graham Jones, who is National Rural Officer for the Methodist Church and the United Reformed Church and is based at the Arthur Rank Centre. Graham, tell me a little bit first about what you do on your average day.
I'm not sure I have an average day, but the Arthur Rank Centre is the church's resource unit for work in rural communities. So we're there to serve the rural community and its churches. And I'm part of the team there on behalf of the Methodist Church and the United Reformed Church. So really it's about serving and resourcing the rural church through networks of rural officers around the connection and the other denominations. It's about waving the rural flag within the denominations to alert the churches to the implications of policy and strategy for rural churches and communities. And it's also about encouraging the churches to engage with the wider rural agenda, such as transport and service provision and affordable housing and agriculture, etc. So,
And you do that on behalf of both Methodist Church and the United Reformed Church, as I mentioned. How do you kind of balance that relationship with the two churches, on one hand representing one, on the other?
well, it seems to dovetail really well. I mean, I'm obviously part of three teams in a sense. I'm part of a team at in the United Reformed Church House. I'm part of a team here at Methodist Church House, and I'm part of a team at the Arthur Rank Centre. I resource directly. I resource a United Reformed Church network of rural officers through their synods, and I directly resource a similar network of rural officers through the Methodist districts. So there are specific tasks that I do and responsibilities that I have to the two denominations, but also a lot of the work that we do, is really serving the wider church throughout the rural communities. So there's much overlap, I think, really.
And I must just apologise to our listeners. There's a lot of banging going on here at Methodist Church. I think someone is building something or knocking something down.
Or trying
Obviously,
to
we'll have to
escape.
cut this short if the floor falls out from underneath us, but we will press on otherwise. Graham, let's just chat a little bit about discipleship. It's a word we're using a lot in the church. It's part of what we're exploring as a community, a Christian community across Great Britain. How do you think discipleship as an expression of being a follower of Christ is playing out in the rural community today?
Well, I think an aspect of church in rural communities that the Methodist Church has stressed over recent years is presence, and in fact we produced a very well used resource called Presence, and I think what that alludes to is the fact that churches in rural communities tend to be really well embedded within their communities. They're a part of their community in a way that I think many suburban and urban churches might envy. And I think that offers and creates great opportunities for discipleship within rural communities. You can't be an anonymous disciple in the countryside because everybody knows that you go to church. And so, as I say, I think that creates great opportunities. The church is seen as a very real part of the wider community. There was a piece of research done actually by DEFRA not too many years ago, which asked people which services they valued within their rural communities. And actually the church came in the top 5 of those services.
That's quite surprising when people are talking about decline in church attendance in Britain today and people actually increased secularisation of the nation. Does that surprise you?
Well, I think there was an element of surprise about it. And in fact, when I asked that question of people which they think the top 5 services provided in rural communities are, most church people don't believe that the church comes in the top 5. And I think that so alongside the sort of rising secularism, if you like, there's the there's the dwindling confidence sometimes of the church. So
Do you think we sometimes talk ourselves out of a job?
I think I guess most people in the church have lived through a lifetime of decline, and I think that erodes people's confidence. But actually, the evidence, as I say, was that churches in rural communities are valued very highly, and and they're just seen as being part of the community. And in fact, even people who may never darken the door of a church will in some way own the church as theirs and take responsibility for it. Now that can sometimes be painted in a negative light. That you're not allowed to change anything in the church because people who don't even have anything to do with the church won't let you. But I'd rather view it in a much more positive light, because it's an opportunity, because people feel that church is in some sense is theirs, and that they have a relationship with it. And I think that's an opportunity for mission in our rural communities.
And we talk about the church being a place of presence in rural communities, and Christians are called essentially to follow Jesus in that context, to be disciples of Jesus. What do you think? What kind of Jesus do you think we are following in the rural countryside, in the rural areas, the rural church? What kind of Jesus are we called to be following after? Do we need to wear wellies?
Well, I don't think Jesus wore wellies, and probably wearing sandals wouldn't help. I think what Jesus showed us was that that God was interested and involved in the everyday nitty gritty of our lives, and I think it's that incarnational model that Jesus inspires within the rural church. So yes, it is about presence, but it is about an intentional presence. It's about being present within a community and seeking to serve the whole community. I think it's that sort of altruism, if you like, looking for the good of the other rather than the church seeking to serve its own needs. And I think Jesus, offered that model for us, that he came to serve, not to be served. And I think many rural churches take that very seriously, and they do see themselves as a part of the community, and they ask what I think is the primary missional question, which is, what is God doing? What is God doing in this community, and how can we join in with that? And they identify the needs within their community, and they seek to address them. And I think they're doing that because they're inspired by what they understand was the mission of Jesus, who came, to serve all and not just a few.
And what does that look like, the church serving the needs of the community? Because church serving the need of a community in a town or a city might be Sunday worship because people aren't going to work on a weekend, or it might be evening house groups because people have got the time then. What does it look like in the rural areas?
Well, it looks quite diverse, I suppose. But one example I would give is that we've been very keen to encourage churches to use their buildings in a very creative way, because they are a considerable asset. Often we view them as millstones around our neck, but we'd rather they were viewed as stepping stones to mission and to discipleship. So, for example, we've encouraged churches to host post offices or to host community shops, and more recently to host Citizens Advice Bureau. And we've worked in partnership with other organisations, with the Post Office and with CAB, to produce guidelines that will encourage those sorts of relationships. I think that's a prime example of the church seeking to identify the needs of their community and be part of the solution.
And is there an end game to that, in the sense of, this is all about sharing the gospel, so we hope that someone might come to church for CAB, or they might come to church for debt advice or whatever, and then maybe they'll eventually give their life to Jesus. Is that the kind of
Well,
trajectory we hope?
it might not be viewed quite so sort of cause and effect as that, but I think what's going on in many senses is that that such activities increase the credibility of the church within the community, which which I think then allows the church to tell its story, and allows individuals to tell their stories. I think many people are perhaps a little tired of the church seeking to serve its own ends and its own needs, and so there becomes this gulf between the church and the wider community. Whereas I think when the church is embodied within its community and is seeking the well-being of the whole community, that gulf is bridged, and I think that credibility offers and allows the church the opportunity to tell its story, and so that's what as I said earlier, it's not just about being present. It's not just about doing good things. It's about an intentional presence that seeks the well-being of the community, but also seeks, along with that, the opportunity to tell its story.
And the rural church, I think, can often be thought of perhaps as part of the forgotten part of the church, where the decision-making bodies of the church tend to be in cities, and a lot of the resourcing tends to be in the towns, and we think of growing churches as urban churches. But what do you think the urban church can learn from the rural church?
Well, I think the rural church can at times feel a little marginalised, as many rural communities do. But we should recognise that under most definitions of rural, up to 2/3 of Methodist churches are in rural communities, and I think, I think there is huge diversity, within rural communities. So there are no sort of blueprints for success, or that urban or suburban churches can pick up from rural. In fact, I think one of the key lessons, if you like, from rural is that you have to understand your context, and that's not just the broad rural context, but you have to understand that two communities 2 miles apart might have very different characteristics and very different histories, and it's to be effective in mission and discipleship, you have to understand your context. So if there was a general lesson that could be learned, I think it would be that the importance of understanding and really becoming a part of your context, so that then what you do and the way you are is relevant and is contextual.
And if you're a church leader in a circuit somewhere in a rural area, what do you think are the specific challenges that are faced there? Because you've talked about isolation being one of the factors for rural communities. It must be isolated to be a rural minister.
I think it can be, and I think we need to really consider new models of ministry. I mean, the idea that you can just go on adding more and more churches to the list of a minister's under a minister's care.
Because we end up with very large circuits, don't we? A minister in charge of
Absolutely.
8, 9
8, 9,
churches.
10 churches, and I think we're approaching the point where that model is no longer sustainable. And one of the things that we encourage at the Arthur Rank Centre is something called local collaborative ministry, and we have a couple of training days on it in the near future. And that's an idea that you can find in other rural parts of the world, in fact, in New Zealand, Australia, Canada, the States. And really, in a nutshell, or maybe it's as a strapline, it has the ministry of the baptized. And it's basically about empowering the lay people so that we move from being communities that are centred on a minister to being ministering communities. And it lets go of this model that says in order to have a church community, you must have an ordained professional. And it actually says the responsibility for the mission and ministry of any given church and community lies with the people who are actually present within that community. So we're keen to develop that a fairly radical approach to ministry, actually.
Would you not have some people saying, well, actually, I pay my contribution to the church so that we have a minister. Don't ask me to do it for free.
Well, you might have people saying that, and obviously you'd therefore have some way to go in terms of helping people to understand that we all have a responsibility and for mission and ministry, and that responsibility is follows baptism. You don't require ordination to have that responsibility. It follows on from baptism. So we all the baptized have a responsibility for mission and ministry. And where this approach has been adopted, people I've experienced it myself in New Zealand and Australia, and people are empowered, people are liberated, people discover gifts within themselves and within the community that were long suppressed. And it's there's a job of education to be done with ministers and with lay people, because the idea that the church's ministry is dependent on the ordained is something that plenty of lay people are happy to collude with. So I think both need to be liberated from that, and I think it then would create a much more sustainable model of ministry and mission.
And we are nearly out of time, but I do want to ask you talked about the importance of story sharing and being empowered to tell our story, having confidence to tell our story. If one of our listeners had never heard anything about rural Methodism, what would be the one story you'd want them to hear?
I'd want them to hear the story of Methodism's commitment to the well-being of the whole community. I think that would be the essence of the mission of Methodism within the countryside is this embeddedness of the church, and the fact that there is no clear demarcation between the church community and the wider community, because the church is embedded within and is an expression of the incarnation, in that sense, that it is God present within the wider community. And I think that incarnational model of ministry is lies at the heart of how Methodism understands itself, and I think is particularly well expressed in many of our rural communities.
Wonderful. Well, that is all we have time for today, especially with all that bang going on. I'm slightly worried the building's going to fall down on top of us, so we will get out quick. But if you're listening and you want to track down some more design podcasts, you can go to www.methodist.org.uk/design. That's DSIGN. And if you want to reflect on the issues further, either by yourself or with others, you might like to make use of the design postcards, and you can find out more about them at that web address as well. Graham, thank you so much for your time.
A pleasure.